Hello and welcome to my channel. Today's video will be all about trying markers for what feels like the first time. I have actually used markers in the past, considering I've been collecting markers for over a decade now, technically, but the issue is I've never gone and completed a full artwork. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure, but thinking back, as a teenager, Copics were like candy, going to a candy store, but you know, the art version of that, and everybody wanted to own Copics. So everybody would be always picking out one by one, like accumulating them. And I think this is what happened with me as well, and why I ended up with a collection. Not a large one, but you know, an amount that you could probably create at least some artworks over the years. So essentially, after 15 years of owning a bunch of markers, I'm actually attempting to create a somewhat finished piece. It's in a sketchbook, and I used this mixed media paper by Strathmore, which is fairly smooth and works well with markers. I've already kind of dabbled a little bit with like some sketches. But that's about it, what I use my markers for, just like sketchy and mixed media art here and there, but sadly they kind of just mostly have been sitting around unused, which I know is terrible. I don't have like giant sets. I think after 15 years I have maybe 30 Copics in total, and I did actually use them up, like a couple of them, especially because I think I drew Spider-Man a bunch of times, so the red one went pretty quickly, and I did do maybe a smaller artworks that I didn't even record. But again, it's smaller, and when you're using like a couple of colors, it's fairly easy, I suppose you could say, if you kind of know approximately what you're doing. But I find like dealing with skin tones and a whole bunch of different areas, using a whole variation, and really focusing on lighting to some degree is a whole other ballpark. And yeah, hilariously enough, I didn't even realize I left my watercolor palette there in the corner until I was watching back the footage. So, spoiler alert, it just never gets used. This mixed media paper in particular is just not really great with watercolor because it's pretty thick, but it's just not great with a wet media. And it's kind of funny that I ended up buying the sketchbook again, even though I had noted that the first time when I filled it up. So I'm just inking away at Heng IL. Here, I decided to do him as the subject matter just because when I briefly looked over at the selection of colors I have, I realized I had the right colors to do his outfit and basically the entire piece for the most part. Now this is what where I'm reminded also why I don't really use the markers, and I am not quite a fan of them, is the fact that you do need a large selection of them, or at least, how should I put it, maybe a better selection. So if I were to redo purchasing alcohol markers ever again, I would just go with a smaller set of the more intense bright colors and darker colors, and then a larger set of pastels perhaps, and then custom select a bunch of different colors that I probably may find I particularly want or need, just like I basically do with paints. Ultimately, this was kind of a journey for myself to see whether or not I actually really like working with markers, because as I said, I hadn't even attempted to try to make a final piece. And honestly, I probably could make these work. Everything I'm saying is probably just more excuses as to why I don't really use them much. I think this is like the most panicked I was. As you it might not be able to tell, but with the face, it ended up a bit streaky when I started trying to fill in the whole thing. I think I was going back and forth whether I was going to leave any white space, and I got very panicked and I colored it in very streakily instead of just fully coloring it in. I think I was expecting the color to be lighter. That's another thing with the markers that sometimes I'm really like stressed out and not used to. Even though I am testing it on a paper on the side that you can't see, I still got all panicked and some part of my brain just like was freaking out, so I used an excessive amount of the blender for this artwork, just always trying to fix that up. But I think his face still ended up a bit streaky. I'm not actually sure if the color itself maybe was on the dry side. It is the Art and Fly markers. Just a brief mentioning of the Art and Flies. I just got a skin set and a gray set because they were like the smallest sets you could possibly get on Amazon, at least from Canada at the time when I did purchase them, and I would not recommend them. They are juicy and they work really well, but the problem is the markers themselves are a very crappy plastic. It seems like the lids will click and they feel like they close very well, but I have had a bunch dry up even though they're fully shut, and like, you know, you got the click. They're also kind of hard to close. I don't really particularly enjoy the shape. I mean, the nibs themselves feel fine. It doesn't feel like there's anything too wrong with them, but overall it's just much lower quality. I would definitely recommend just going with Ohuhu. The only reason I hadn't was because it was a larger set, and again, I didn't want to pile up on the markers I already wasn't using, but I did find the issue that I was lacking seriously in skin tone colors, so hence why I had bought them. And the same thing with a gray set. It's just with the Winsor & Newton set, it's not bad. It's just I find the in-betweens, and this even happened with the Art and Fly as well, is, for example, I think it's Warm Gray 3 and Warm Gray 4, or Warm Gray 4 and Warm Gray 5. Two of them just feel like basically the same color. I did not see any different shift, which was very frustrating working on it, because I needed something in between, you know, 2 and 4, and I wasn't getting it because I think 2 is too light and then 4 is too dark. So this is the issue where, you know, you kind of run into it where you're like, I need that difference. I managed to compensate and work with it. I'm sure somebody more skilled and more experienced with markers would be fine with it and figure it out, but it's one of those things where if you're mixing paint, you kind of know that it's a little bit easier to do. So one technique I did pick up on through some tutorials a little bit back is just having the multiple markers you're going to be using for blending on hand and with the caps open, so you're just ready to go and just like switching between hands. I only use that technique for the horn though, not because I forgot about it, but because I'm a bit hectic and I panic a lot when I'm using a medium I'm not very familiar with, which I don't even think you can entirely tell in this video. Maybe you can. Anytime I sort of look like I'm grabbing or going back or something, it's just me trying to figure out which marker, but since this is sped up, I think it kind of hides that fact quite well. It's really funny that I actually had a lot of these kind of aqua turquoise colors. I think it's just like one of my favorite colors, perhaps. Some of them did actually come in the set, but all the Copics, I never bought a set for Copics, so that means I would have had to individually purchase any of these at any which given point, and they all kind of worked well. I think I had some inkling of an idea when I was making these purchases. I was a teenager, so, you know, you just enter an art store and ooh, shiny kind of thing, and you grab whatever color you sort of like without rhyme or reason or thinking about what inventory you have. So yeah, like this one that I grabbed and the previous Copic one is basically the same color. I thought the Copic one was lighter because of the cap, but it turns out even Copic markers are actually like a lot of people always say, oh, the Copic marker caps are the exact same color as they're coming out. I think maybe perhaps if you were using it on specific marker paper, it would come out exactly, but there are a few where are pretty sus and different, and you definitely want to be trying every single marker, no matter how expensive and whatever they say, on a piece of paper. I already was fairly familiar with that particular color, so it was no shock to me when I was adding it, so that's fine. I believe I was originally going to fill all the white parts in with actually gray, but I chickened out once again, and I just blended a lot with the blender marker, which I have to say the Winsor & Newton one is very satisfying. I remember having a Copic one at some point, and I didn't really like it. I didn't find that it did much, but this one, I don't know if it just has a ton of alcohol in there, so it works fairly well even for somebody as chaotic and amateurish or even beginnerish actually as me. So I was fairly satisfied. Every time I wanted the thing to blend, it blended. It did it well. So I don't know if you can just buy the Winsor & Newton blender one and separately, but if you can, I recommend that one if you feel like you like using that one. I know a lot of people I don't think even use it, but if you're one that maybe does like using the blender marker, the Winsor & Newton one is definitely one to grab, because I find it's very satisfying. It's very satisfying to use, very juicy. Obviously, always test it out yourself on a piece of paper, a scrap piece of paper that you're already going to use, because I'm not sure if it's just because of the paper surface I was using that it just works so well on. So it would probably require a few tests, but I mean I feel like it might just overall still work. Again, just test for yourself before you go in diving into your own artwork. So now the hair part, I don't know if you can already tell, it's in an ugly stage, and this is where I struggle with the warm grays, not having the in-betweens that I really wanted, even though it was like labeled from warm gray 1 to 4, or 1 to 5, I think. 5 is fairly dark, and I think it's 3 and 4 specifically that just don't feel like they are different enough and feel very much similar, which was very frustrating, especially when you're kind of relying on it to actually be a gradient of color. Despite that, I think I managed to do an okay job. There was a little bit of messiness here or there because, again, I think I did the whole panicked speed thing where when I'm panicking, I kind of end up doing things a little bit faster without thinking kind of deal. But I like the overall shapes. I know where I would improve and fix and change things for sure, but it was all right. Like the green parts of his hair, I think were just very not well thought out, and I kind of just tossed them in there, here and there. But I kind of still like that regardless. And here is basically where I start with the gold details, which I wasn't entirely happy about, going back to not having all the colors needed. I think a green gold probably would have benefited, or just not as saturated, like, just in my opinion. I think it still kind of worked out. It's just I felt it was a bit of the too intense yellowy gold. Also, I think the one reason why I mostly hated it, not so much on the touches on his glove, but the sleeve part, I had anyway drawn it incorrectly, and then going in with a gold detail, I barely even knew what I was doing, because I was trying to draw the sleeve upside down, looking at reference at a completely different angle, and trying to imagine how the sleeve would look with his arm lifted up like that. And I'm pretty sure I messed it up quite a bit of how it would supposed to look. Overall, like I said, just frustrating that it's all the wrong shapes, and I had drawn the sleeve wrong, so I think it was just frustrating to work on this part in particular with not the colors that I wanted, coloring it in wrong anyway, and just all the details being wrong on how it's supposed to be, and trying to figure out how that sleeve would work in that direction. So, there's always the one part that sometimes will just frustrate you to oblivion while you're working on it. I will say, I feel like the blender marker, though, really made me much happier. Once again, it really quite saved the day about how it was definitely blending, because I felt like the darker brownish color I was using versus the gold were quite drastic, and I was a little worried, but once I used the blender one, it mixed really nicely. Now I was just basically into the details and working on the background watery bits. But after stressing about all the gold parts, which were definitely not my favorite to paint, I moved on to coloring in the water for the background. So I think I had in mind maybe to do a solid color background as well along with the water, but I realized because it's markers, it would mean wasting quite a bit of ink just to color in the background, and I wasn't entirely sure what color in the end to do. And I say wasting because I believe one color I had in mind, like a bit darker turquoise color, I think it was kind of closer to the end of its life, so I didn't think it would manage to survive being covered entirely. And for this piece, it kind of works to not do anything else other than a white background. So my final impressions of completing an artwork with a mostly entirely marker. The thing that actually got me to sit down and create this artwork in the first place and decide upon whether or not I really was enjoying using markers was the fact that I started getting really bombarded by Ohuhu ads on Instagram. So the temptation to buy more markers was incredibly high. But my final verdict is I won't be buying another marker set. I didn't quite have that much fun coloring this in as much as I usually do using any kind of paints in general. I think it's just the fact that I miss having the option of being more able to more easily mix any colors that I want. I guess I'm more of just a painterly kind of girl and just prefer paints. I suppose I'm more of a painterly kind of girl and just prefer paint then. Perhaps there's a lesson somewhere in there. To make sure you actually use the current art supplies you have and not give in to buying more the second you see an ad. Does anybody else have an art supply that's been sitting around their house for 1,000 years and they only realize that they just have not actually even committed to a final artwork? Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope if you are trying markers out, I hope they bring you joy. For me, it's just not as much, but that's okay. I still overall enjoyed the way the piece looked. So if you got this far, thanks so much for watching.